It's another crazy week in MMA, with big signings, huge controversies, and some pretty hilarious failures. Dillon Danis, we're looking at you. We're going to take a dive into some of the week's most interesting topics, and trust us, there's quite a lot to get through. Let's get into it. First off, YouTuber turned boxing sensation Jake Paul has inked a deal with the rising MMA promotion PFL, signing a multi-year contract with he hopes will bring him 2 different matchups in 2023. But here's where it gets interesting. As you might expect, Paul is set on competing in boxing, so he can build on the huge momentum he has been able to garner for himself in recent years. However, he has also made it clear that fighting in MMA is very much on the cards for him, and that his training has been ongoing a lot longer than most believe. Jake claims that he has been working on rounding out his game for over a year now, despite having only tested himself in the squared circle up to this point. With his name now firmly aligned with PFL, Paul extended one hell of an offer to the recently released free agent Nate Diaz. Diaz left the UFC last year on good terms, beating the former interim lightweight champion Tony Ferguson after UFC 279's chaotic fight week deprived him of his fight with Khamzat Chimaev. All things considered though, Nate did quite well to avoid the unbeaten Chechen welterweight, and now, with yet another big name win under his belt, Diaz is in a pretty strong position coming into 2023. So what did Jake Paul offer him? Well, we knew that there was at least some interest in a boxing fight between these two, and in Jake's offer that will happen. But instead of just fighting once, Jake has extended an invitation for a 2-fight spell, one inside the boxing ring and the second 6 months later in the PFL cage. Yes, that's right, Paul wants to test himself in MMA against one of the toughest fighters in the game. Of course, nothing has been signed just yet, and if we had to bet on it, we doubt that Jake Paul would take on Nate so early into his training. But as a way of drumming up fan interest, it's pretty clear that Jake is on to another winner with this one. As things stand, Diaz has not yet responded, although it was made clear by him in the past that he is looking for big money fights. After Paul's impressive decision victory over the great but aging Anderson Silva, it's clear that he has at least some skill in the ring. But Nate's pedigree as a straight-up boxer is a different level entirely. Not only is he closer to his fighting prime than Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley, and Anderson Silva, but his style of striking is far closer to a traditional boxing game than any of these guys. And his years working with his brother Nick and the legendary former boxer Andre Ward no doubt will make his transition to boxing a lot easier than those other MMA veterans. It's hard to know how serious Jake Paul is about fighting in MMA, and even if he is, whether or not he would get in there with a high-level grappler like Nate Diaz. But for now, it's pretty fair to assume that we'll be seeing this massive matchup in the boxing ring before too long. And for Nate, you can't help but be happy for the guy, because win, lose or draw, he's going to get one hell of a payday, that's for sure. Who would you back if a boxing bout between these two was set up? Would it be the youth and power of Jake Paul or the veteran savvy and uncoachable toughness of Nate Diaz? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, the biggest story in MMA right now has been continuing to make waves, as the UFC president Dana White finds himself under the microscope once again. In the days that followed the beginning of 2023, worrying details came to the surface that placed White at the center of a domestic violence incident involving his wife of 26 years, Anne. Dana and his wife were attending a New Year's party in Cabo, Mexico, and were filmed engaging in a heated argument. Dana's wife slapped him first, before White retaliated with 2 more slaps. Naturally, this incident became one of the biggest stories in the sporting world, with many major figures within the MMA world calling for Dana to be held accountable for his actions. The pair released a statement shortly after, where they blamed excessive drinking for their altercation, ensuring the world that this was the first and only time this had happened. Dana in the past has made it clear that domestic violence is something that one doesn't just bounce back from, but apart from this short statement, the UFC have made no comment. The veteran reporter Ariel Helwani had some choice words for the UFC president, taking a half hour out of his weekly show to give his thoughts on the matter, and trust us, he did not hold back. Dana's past dealings with fighters with domestic violence charges against them was brought up, with the huge push the UFC gave Greg Hardy at the forefront. But the single, most cutting line of all was delivered last, as Helwani reminded White of a comment he made towards him back in 2016, when he asked what Ariel's kids would think when they saw their father crying on live TV after being ousted from his job. Helwani has had a pretty awful relationship with Dana White in recent years, and for him, there was probably some satisfaction taken as he ended his long rant by asking Dana the exact same question. "They were talking about me crying, and he said, 'Your kids are going to see that. Your kids are going to see one day,' and how embarrassed they would be by seeing their father cry." So on this day, I will raise the same freaking question that he raised about me in 2016. What are your kids going to say about you? What are your kids going to say about your legacy? The way you treat fighters, the way you treat people, about your business practices? What are your kids going to say about that video? What are your kids going to say about the kind of person you are? What are your kids going to say about you? Ask yourself that effing question. What are your kids going to say about you? Either way, we're certainly in for a very interesting few weeks for White and the UFC. And as expected, Dana's Power Slap League has been left with its future totally up in the air. As things stand, Helwani doesn't believe that White will suffer any major consequences for his actions, and that his post as the president of the world's premier mixed martial arts is not in any danger. Public opinion has been split down in the middle on this one, with some fighters and analysts claiming that this should be the final straw for Dana, especially considering the message this would send about tolerance within the sport. Others, of course, are more sympathetic to the circumstances and the nature of the incident. Either way, let us know in the comment section below what you think about this latest scandal within the sports of mixed martial arts. In less shocking news, the sport's most reliably terrible trash talker has pulled out of the biggest payday of his career to date. It's hard to know where Dillon Danis fits within the world of MMA. He talks like Colby or Conor, but you can count his pro fights on one hand, and he always finds himself in the news, but he hasn't fought in years. Anyway, the former BJJ star Danis found himself in the headlines after agreeing to take on YouTuber-turned-boxer KSI, a bout that would have served as his first fight in well over 3 years. As a grappler by trade, it was pretty likely that this would have been a very tough fight for Danis, even with his ongoing MMA training. In his 2 professional fights in the Bellator cage, while his submission skills have looked excellent, Dillon's striking leaves a lot to be desired. Sure, KSI isn't exactly the greatest boxer in the world either, but he certainly has far more experience in the ring. However, with just 10 days to go before the big event, Dillon Danis surprised absolutely nobody by withdrawing from the contest, reportedly due to a total lack of proper preparation. An earlier appearance on Ariel Helwani's The MMA Hour left fans baffled as Danis made it clear that he had no coaches, no solid corner team, and was bouncing around from gym to gym. Helwani, who scored a major 10-8 during this interview, repeatedly made fun for Danis for his total lack of career direction, asking him about the current status of his friendship with Conor McGregor, his inactivity in the cage, and most of all, his constant trash-talking without any legitimate results. Danis in this interview claimed that he would be making more money than any active UFC champion for his fight with KSI, but trust us, you should take that with a pinch of salt. It's not like it matters anymore now. Danis pulled out of the contest just 10 days away from fight night, and though the reasons he gave were unclear, it's pretty obvious that the dude just couldn't pull it all together. To add insult to injury, a Twitter poll that was run by English outlet The Mirror later found that Danis was voted as single most hated athlete in sports today. Maybe it's just recency bias talking, and to be fair to Dillon, there are far more hateable characters in the sporting world. But if that doesn't give you a sense of where this guy's stock is at, nothing will. Dillon Danis needs to compete, and he more than likely will remain a laughingstock within MMA circles until he does so. What do you think forced Dillon Danis to pull out of the biggest payday of his career so far? And do you believe that he's a legitimate prospect within mixed martial arts? Let us know in the comment section below before liking the video and subscribing to the channel, so you can stay up to date with all of our weekly uploads. Thanks for tuning in.